My name is carved into the logbooks of places most people will never see. 32 years I've walked these forests, patrolled ridges where the fog doesn't lift for weeks, where the cedars grow so ancient their roots remember a world before roads and cities. This corner of the Pacific Northwest isn't just remote, it's sacred in a way that makes your breath catch, that makes you feel small in the presence of something vast and patient. I've always respected that feeling, never questioned it, never pushed against the quiet understanding that these woods belong to something older than my badge. The isolation out here changes you slowly, like water wearing stone. There are weeks when I don't see another human face, when the only voices are ravens and the wind moving through branches thick as my torso. My patrol zone stretches across territory that swallows sound, where valleys pool with silence so complete you can hear your own heartbeat echoing back from the mountainside. I learned early to trust my instincts in these woods, to read the language of broken twigs and disturbed moss, to know when something feels wrong, but nothing in 3 decades prepared me for what I would find. Nothing prepared me for the moment when the forest I thought I knew would crack open and reveal its deepest secret. The boundary between legend and truth is thinner than we imagine, and I crossed it without realizing until it was far too late to turn back. What I'm about to tell you has kept me awake more nights than I can count. It started with the footprints. 3 weeks before everything changed, I found them pressed deep into the frozen mud along Whisper Creek. Each impression nearly 18 inches long and shaped like a human foot. But wider, more powerful. The stride measured over 6 feet between prints, and whatever made them had walked through terrain that would have broken a man's ankle. I knelt beside them in the pre-dawn cold, my breath forming clouds that hung in the still air, and felt the hair on my neck rise for reasons I couldn't name. The howls came next, rolling down from the high ridges, just as the sun broke the horizon. Not wolves, not elk, not any animal catalogued in my decades of experience. These were calls that seemed to carry weight, intentionality, a quality that made my bones remember ancient fears buried in human DNA. My radio crackled with static each time they echoed through the valleys, as if the sound itself disrupted frequencies. I started marking each occurrence in my private notebook, afraid to file official reports about something I couldn't explain. Then my equipment began moving. The axe I'd left beside the woodpile appeared on the cabin's far side. My field pack, secured inside, sat arranged neatly on the porch come morning. Nothing stolen, nothing damaged, but rearranged with a deliberateness that felt like communication. I checked for human tracks and found only those massive prints circling my cabin at a distance, as if something had been watching me sleep, studying my routines with an intelligence that made my hands shake. The forest had stopped feeling like home and started feeling like a threshold to something beyond my understanding. The fog rolled in that morning like a living thing, thick enough to muffle sound and turn the forest into a cathedral of grey silence. I hiked to the ridge where I'd found the branches. Dozens of them snapped at shoulder height and woven together in patterns too deliberate to be wind damage. They formed archways and markers pointing toward the deeper wilderness, and standing among them felt like trespassing in a place meant for rituals I couldn't comprehend. I secured the camera to an ancient cedar, my fingers clumsy with cold and something deeper than nervousness. As I adjusted the motion sensor, I noticed fresh bark stripped from nearby trees at heights I couldn't reach without a ladder. The exposed wood underneath showed parallel grooves, 4 distinct lines that could have been claw marks or finger traces. Whatever made them possessed both strength and precision, peeling away the outer layers to reveal pale flesh underneath like unwrapping something sacred. I touched the marks and felt the tree's dampness, still fresh, and realized I might have just missed encountering whatever left them. Setting the camera felt like crossing a boundary I'd never acknowledged before. I was no longer just documenting wilderness. I was attempting to capture evidence of something that perhaps didn't want to be seen. My grandfather's voice echoed in memory, warning that some mysteries protect themselves, that certain truths choose their witnesses. I activated the device and backed away slowly, feeling watched from distances I couldn't measure. The walk back to my cabin stretched longer than usual, each snap twig behind me a question I was afraid to answer. The days that followed became a vigil of watching and waiting, each dawn pulling me deeper into a ritual I didn't fully understand. I found myself leaving the cabin earlier, drawn to places where the footprints appeared, where the tree markings formed their strange alphabet. My grandfather's stories, once dismissed as campfire, entertainment, now played constantly in my mind, like prayers I was finally learning to speak. He'd spoken of forest guardians who existed in the spaces between human understanding, beings who remembered when the world was younger and wilder. I began noticing patterns in the disturbances, a geography of intentional signs that formed a rough circle round my patrol area. 3 stacked stones appeared near the frozen creek, balanced impossibly against the current's memory. Bundles of stripped bark waited on my cabin steps, arranged with care that felt like communication. Each discovery tightened the invisible thread connecting us, this unseen intelligence and my growing obsession to understand rather than classify. My sleep grew thin and populated by dreams of walking through fog, while something massive paced parallel to my path, never threatening, simply present. I'd wake with my heart racing and an inexplicable certainty that I was being evaluated, measured against some ancient standard I couldn't name. The isolation I'd always cherished now felt like preparation, years of solitude training me for this unlikely dialogue. The camera waited on that ridge like a question I'd asked the wilderness, and somewhere in the vast silence, I felt certain an answer was forming. The footage began like any other recording: empty forest, morning mist threading through Douglas, firs, the silent patience of wilderness. Then at timestamp 4 minutes and 17 seconds, the light changed. A shadow separated from shadows, and my breath caught so violently I had to pause the video, hands trembling against the laptop keys. When I pressed play again, the world I thought I understood came undone. The figure moved with impossible fluidity for something so massive, each step deliberate and eerily graceful, as though the forest itself parted in recognition. I watched, frame by frame, zooming until pixels fractured, trying to find the costume seams or digital artifacts that would restore my rational mind. But the musculature was wrong, the proportions defied human. Anatomy, and the way it paused to examine the very camera watching it, suggested an intelligence that made my skin prickle with ancient instinct. Then it turned, and I saw the eyes. Even through compressed digital footage, they held something that statistics and biology couldn't contain, a depth of awareness that felt older than the mountains, a sorrow so profound it seemed to bleed through the screen. I replayed that 3-second glimpse 17 times, each viewing stripping away another layer of my carefully constructed certainty about what was possible. Sitting in that cabin's dim light, footage frozen on that haunting gaze, I understood my grandfather's final words before he passed. Some truths don't want to be captured, son. They want to be witnessed. I watched the footage 43 times across 3 sleepless nights, each viewing revealing details I'd initially missed in shock. The creature moved with purpose, occasionally pausing to touch specific trees marked with subtle carvings I'd mistaken for natural scarring. It was following a path, performing what looked unmistakably like ritual, and the realization struck me with vertigo. This wasn't a random animal wandering through camera range. This was intelligence, culture, ceremony. On the 27th replay, I noticed something that stopped my heart. Behind the primary figure, barely visible through morning, fog moved a smaller silhouette, keeping careful distance. A juvenile, I realized, being taught these ancient roots by its elder. I wasn't witnessing a solitary creature, but evidence of a family, a society, a continuation of knowledge passed down through generations. While humanity remained oblivious, the weight of that discovery pressed against my chest like granite. The footage's final seconds showed the larger figure placing something deliberately at the trail junction. An arrangement of stones in a pattern I'd seen before in grandfather's old journals. Drawings he'd claimed showed forest markers from before European contact. My hands shook as I retrieved those journals, finding the exact configurations sketched decades ago. The connection between human ancestral knowledge and this creature's actions suggested a history we'd forgotten, a relationship severed. I sat in darkness, understanding flooding through me like cold water. We hadn't discovered them. They'd been allowing themselves to be forgotten, watching us from deliberate distance, waiting to see if we'd remember how to be worthy neighbors again. I packed the offering before dawn, dried salmon, wild berries, tobacco wrapped in cedar bark. Gifts my grandfather said the old people would leave at forest thresholds. My hands trembled as I assembled them, knowing I was crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. This wasn't observation anymore. This was reaching across a boundary these beings had established for their own protection. What right did I have to invite contact, to potentially expose them further? The ridge felt different in early light, charged with anticipation that made my skin prickle. I placed the offering on the exact stone formation from the footage, then retreated 30 yards to sit against an ancient cedar. My radio remained clipped to my belt, silent witness to my violation of every protocol. If something went wrong, if I vanished like the old stories warned, no one would understand why I'd come here alone. Hours passed in crystalline silence, broken only by my thundering heartbeat. Doubt crept in with the rising sun. This was foolishness, desperation, the delusion of a man who'd spent too long in isolation. Then the forest changed. Birds stopped calling. The air grew dense with presence. Every instinct screamed to run, but I forced myself to remain still, palms open on my knees in a gesture of peace. The snap of a branch behind me sent electricity down my spine. I didn't turn, couldn't turn, paralyzed between terror and reverence. Something massive moved through the undergrowth, circling my position with deliberate steps that felt like assessment. I was being measured, judged for worthiness by an intelligence older than my comprehension could grasp. The presence moved to my left, just beyond the veil of morning mist, and against every survival instinct, I slowly turned my head. Through the shifting fog, I saw it standing between two massive firs, 8 feet of raw, undeniable existence that shattered the comfortable boundaries of my rational mind. Our eyes locked, and in that suspended moment, a time collapsed into something ancient and profound. What struck me wasn't the physical impossibility, but the unmistakable awareness burning in those dark, intelligent eyes. Fear should have consumed me, but instead I felt something closer to recognition, as if some ancestral memory buried deep in my DNA suddenly awakened. The creature didn't move, with animal unpredictability, but with measured consideration that spoke of choice, of restraint, of judgment. I saw in its posture not aggression, but caution, the wariness of a being that had learned to fear humanity's capacity for destruction. My grandfather's words echoed through my mind. They were here first, and they remember everything we've forgotten. The moment stretched between us like a bridge across impossible distances, species separated by evolution, yet bound by something neither science nor language could adequately name. I felt tears streaming down my face without shame, overwhelmed by the sacred weight of bearing witness to a mystery the modern world insisted couldn't exist. This wasn't discovery. This was being granted permission to see what had always been hidden. Then, with heartbreaking gentleness, the creature took one step backward into the mist and vanished as if it had never been. The forest exhaled, returning to morning sounds, leaving me forever altered by proof that wonder still walks among us. I Hiked back to my cabin in silence, every certainty I'd built my career upon crumbling like old paper. For 30 years, I'd patrolled these forests believing I understood their boundaries, their inhabitants, their secrets. Now I realized I'd been a guest in a kingdom far older and more complex than any map could capture. The weight of that footage in my camera felt less like evidence and more like a confession, proof that our dominion over nature was always an illusion we told ourselves for comfort. That night, I sat with the decision that would define the rest of my life. I could release the footage, invite the chaos of researchers and hunters and curious crowds that would transform this sacred wilderness into a spectacle. Or I could honor what I'd witnessed by becoming its keeper, understanding that some truths serve the world better as mysteries than as conquests. My grandfather taught me that respect means knowing when to speak and when to protect through silence. I chose protection, not from cowardice, but from love for what remains wild and free. The creature didn't reveal itself to make me famous or to validate human curiosity. It showed itself as a test of whether I'd earned the privilege of coexistence, whether I understood that sharing this earth means leaving space for what we cannot own or control. Now I walk these forests differently, no longer as a ranger, asserting authority, but as a guardian of thresholds. I carry the secret like a sacred trust, forever humbled by the knowledge that wonder survives only when we choose reverence over revelation, mystery over mastery. My retirement came quietly 3 years after that morning, and I left the ranger station without fanfare or explanation. My colleagues noticed something had changed in me during those final years, how I'd grown protective of certain territories, how I'd redirect hikers away from particular ridges with excuses about trail conditions or wildlife activity. They assumed I'd simply grown territorial in my old age, never suspecting I was drawing invisible borders around a truth too profound for casual discovery. I destroyed the footage on a winter evening, watching the files delete with both grief and relief. That evidence could have validated every cryptozoologist's career, could have rewritten textbooks and sparked expeditions that would never end. But I remembered those eyes meeting mine across the clearing, that moment of mutual recognition that felt less like discovery and more like covenant. The creature had trusted me with its existence by not fleeing, by holding my gaze long enough to communicate something beyond words, a message about coexistence that required no proof beyond personal transformation. Now I live in a small cabin at the forest's edge, close enough to keep watch, far enough to avoid suspicion. I still hear the calls sometimes at dawn, distant and haunting, and I whisper my own acknowledgement into the mist. Other rangers have reported strange occurrences in my old territory, and I listen to their stories with careful silence, offering no explanations that might encourage deeper investigation. The greatest discoveries aren't meant to be shared, but protected, held close like prayers we whisper only to ourselves and the wild spaces that still shelter what humanity has forgotten how to honor. I will die with this secret, and the forest will keep it long after I'm gone. What would you protect if you knew the truth? Would destroy it? Subscribe to hear more stories from the edge of the unknown.